Share my screen. So this one's a little hands-on for me, so I'll be facing all kinds of different ways. So please don't take it personally, but it's very lovely to be here. So, yep, we're here to talk about Vega. We'll talk a little bit more about what that is as we go through. So yeah, just to introduce myself further, I'm an MVP based in Christchurch for the Microsoft Data Platform. I have my little consulting company called Kochuva, but also work for a company in Australia called Discovery AI, and we work a lot on environmental data and science. And a lot of what we do in Power BI is like what a lot of people do, but we often have needs to produce particular visuals that aren't part of the standard set. The environmental industry has a number of visuals that are particularly standard for them, but not necessarily standard for the usual situations we have in Power BI. So I'm a full stack developer, but I'm generally interested in the visual layer with Power BI for my sort of, I guess, for fun, if you can call it fun, but I enjoy it quite a lot. I submit and develop visuals to AppSource, which is the store within Power BI, if you're familiar with that. So if there's some you may have heard of, I started with one that's actually in the middle because for some reason the order doesn't make sense, called the small multiple line chart, which was my initial hate journey in terms of learning the custom visuals framework, because I'm sure like a lot of people, we don't really want to learn something until we necessarily have to use it. And it's quite a hard thing to learn on demand, but that was something that I needed badly enough to learn how to develop custom visuals. The second one after that was the visual called the violin plot, which you see on the left there. Very fortunate that Microsoft have featured that in some of their marketing, which I'm quite excited about. And my latest AppSource contribution is probably the simplest, which is visual called HTML content, which is just a way of allowing you to put HTML inside visuals as much as Power BI will allow. I also like to play with other tools like Charticulator. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's a tool that Microsoft has made available for building visuals inside Power BI. There's a couple of examples here, a few of the older ones, and then the ones on the right are ones I've been playing with since the visuals got into Power BI as a custom visual. So there's a KPI card there. I don't know if you know Havens BI, Reed Havens, who's an MVP in the US. He does a lot of conversations with a lot of people. We did a video stream a couple of weeks ago on how to build that, which was quite a long time, but quite ultimately worth it. And then just for fun, a very info-dense chart on Pokemon hit point distribution, because why not? But I'm very interested in how Charticulator works with Power BI to make visualization simpler, so you don't have to go full pelt. I'm here today to talk about that particular journey. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the options in Power BI for visualization, how we might be able to find a middle ground between those, and hopefully have some time to do a little bit of a demo. So I'm sure a lot of you work across the many facets of Power BI, and you've probably worked on a number of BI projects in general. My background is...
The screen's not refreshing on Teams.
Is it not?
No, because we're still at Daniel's very first one with the violin graphics.
Oh, it has changed. I can see Daniel changing it.
Yeah, I'm getting it changed, Richard.
So are we fairly unanimous?
It's working.
That it's working. Yeah. Okay.
So just want to jump out and jump back in, Richard.
I guess.
If you like looking at me, that's great. But I mean, I don't like looking at me. So what we'll do is we'll carry on. If that's all right. Yeah, lovely. So I've worked on a number of sort of full stack BI projects. They're quite involved, but we all know that a lot of people see visuals as the output of what we do. A lot of you perhaps understand that 80 to 90% of the work is modeling, design, transformations, making everything clean and nice. But your stakeholders often see the visuals. That's their window to your work. So it's very easy in Power BI to pick and choose visuals and produce something that does the job. But it's quite a large area in itself that we perhaps don't get a lot of exposure to in our day-to-day work. So in terms of things we can currently do, this is a little chart I've refined over time. And if we look in terms of, on the left is the easy stuff. And this is a term that's used, it was coined by Christian Wade, who's on the Microsoft team. He's an incredibly influential guy. But the idea about visuals being clicky, drag and droppy, very easy to use. You can just drag them onto the canvas and start using them. What I've done is I've set a boundary of what I would call something like low code and low code over on the right hand side. This is where we're really delving into the weeds. So in terms of where you would set things up inside Power BI, the first and obvious choice is you've got core visuals. Core visuals are built by Microsoft, and they're responsive, they work, they're rich, and they're really well polished. But I'm sure a few of you have reached the situations where core visuals don't perhaps do what you want. So the next step might be you would look at AppSource, which is the marketplace within Power BI, and you might look for a particular type of visual, and hopefully be able to choose that, install it, run it, start configuring it, and get what you want. Completely the other side of that, you've got the option to develop a custom visual yourself. So this is a journey I've taken. I've probably been doing it for about 3 or 4 years now. It's a very different skill set to what you might be used to. Some of you may be familiar with web development tools and technologies, but it's not DAX and M. It's having to learn how to do web development. It's having to learn how to understand the Power BI layers. They have a very good software development kit for visuals, perhaps not very well documented. We're getting better at learning it, and I spend a lot of time on the forums helping people with their particular challenges, but ultimately it's right over the far side. It's probably the hardest thing you can do in terms of getting a visual yourself. It does make you appreciate how hard it is to deliver those ones on the left, I can tell you that. Just on the right side of low code, we won't dwell on it today, but to articulate it, if you haven't seen it, it's very worth looking into as a tool. Built by Microsoft, now part of AppSource, so you can install it. It's a visual UI for designing your own bespoke visuals. So you have to think a little bit differently, but you use very little code. It's very much drag and drop and very easy to use. Towards the other side, we've got some more complexity, but not as complex, in the form of R and Python visuals. So has anybody used those already? Yeah, a few people. For me, that was and for a lot of people I've talked to, that's a kind of gateway drug to the one on the right. You try and resist the one on the right as much as possible. You maybe try and reason with R and Python first because they're a little bit easier to get into, and they're not just Microsoft specific. They're languages that are used all over the place. They're very good for data science, and there's a lot of good visual packages. So there is a way in there. So let's have a look a little bit very quickly at an R visual. What I'm just going to do is, Phil, can you just, is this coming up all right on Teams?
Yep.
Awesome, because I'm going to change windows a few times. I just want to make sure. So what we have here is, this is just a simple workbook where I've added, got a financial. This is just the standard financial data that comes with Power BI when you choose get data from a sample. I've just modeled it into a star schema, but what we're ultimately looking at is just very quickly, we've got a measure for sales, and country is a nominal variable. So I've just done a very simple bar chart here using a tool called ggplot2. So if anyone's used R, this is a library that you can install. And I might just zoom in. We should be able to see it fine in the room, but I'll just zoom in a bit. When we click on the visual, Power BI exposes a small editor, and I need to have the R language installed on my environment. But I can write some R code in here, and I've declared the ggplot library. And then what I've done is I've started to chain together a bunch of declarative functions. So I've said, use my data set, add an aesthetic, and put country on the x-axis and sales on the y-axis, and use a column geometry, which is not what you're seeing, but we'll get to that in a moment. The width of that column is 70%, or 0.7. And then right at the bottom, we've got this function called coord flip, which basically turns it on its side. So this visual is actually a column chart flipped into a bar chart. But this is a set of steps that you describe, much like you would in, say, Power Query when you're transforming your data, but it's very simple to follow. And this is something that the ggplot library is very good at. But I have this visual here. It doesn't really have any features. It works. And obviously, I wouldn't necessarily produce a bar chart, but a bar chart's very easy to show you on how to get started. But once this visual's in, one of the downsides is it's not particularly interactive. It's basically a static image. I can't really do much with it. I need to have R installed on my machine. Now, on my desktop, on desktop, that's on my machine. In the service, Microsoft hosts a version of R that will try and run your visuals. But if you're using a library that isn't supported, that could be a challenge. You have a 5-minute timeout for anything you do. So if you produce a particularly complex visual with a big data set and a lot of transformations and a very rich output, you might be limited by the resources that Microsoft make available. And as I say, there's a static image and no interactivity features. So you can get started. You have some flexibility. You can start taking a language that you may have learned elsewhere. But but you can be a little bit limited. But it's great that the support exists. But yeah, in terms of the advantages, we can use libraries like ggplot, which we don't have to learn R. We just have to learn enough of the syntax so that a library that abstracts these things into a higher level can work for us. And we tend to have a high degree of customization, so we can see we're already starting to change the width of the bars by just prescribing a few things. So it's lower level than Power BI. Power BI has property menus and everything else, which is really nice. But once we get into the back end, we actually can do a little bit more. So the challenge we have here is, if we have a dedicated user interface, if it's a good one, this can be really good for our workflow, and it can be good for producing visuals and so on and so forth in these use cases. And a lot of these tools, like Power BI, they will actually have something like a palette of visuals. So we could choose a chart that we know, and we start with that. So we pick it, we add it, we configure our properties, and we're good. But ultimately, we've got bar charts, we've got column charts, we've got combo charts. For the most part, they're all just made from the same shapes, bars, rectangles. So we've got 5 different visuals there, for instance, that essentially do the same thing, but they're treated as different visual types. But this can be a little difficult because we're working with what someone's idea of a visual should be. We have a preconceived notion in our head of what we're going to use, and it's constrained by what's exposed through the interface. So in the case of the core visuals or even custom visuals that we develop, we have to expose properties for users. We have to expose the logic for those properties, and we have to ultimately, there's a cycle there of maybe a user wants a new property, and there's a feedback loop, there's a development cycle. In the case of Microsoft, core visuals, maybe updates of desktop will release those features. With a custom visual, if you're Jeff, you can probably just yell at them loud enough on Twitter and they'll acquiesce to his demands. But
live and hope.
But there's still a feedback loop. You're still constrained. You are still limited by somebody's idea of what a visual should be like. And obviously, feedback loops are very important for us as developers. But for me as a developer, I choose to develop a particular visual. Somebody may have a better idea as to how that works. I'm just making things available. I'm writing code to facilitate things. And then when we get into situations like a visual doesn't do what you want, how many people have put one visual over the top of another one?
One. I've put about 8 over the top of one.
Tougher room. I think certainly in the wider world, a lot of people's problems have been solved by putting multiple visuals over the top, and then you have issues with things like axes not being the same and numerous other things. And then we start to lose those. We get performance issues or user issues depending on how visuals are laid out. So it's a little bit tricky. But if we think back to ggplot that we just saw, that offers a different perspective. It breaks up charts into functional elements. So we saw that we were doing things like saying the bars need to be a certain width. We need to bind certain fields to the X and Y axes, and so on and so forth. And a tool like Charticulator is the same. Obviously, we're not going to show you that today. You have to take it on faith a little bit. But there's starting to become a lot of videos and resources out there on Charticulator now, if you're curious. I am presenting on Charticulator at Affinity if you're going. But if you can't wait till then, I'd recommend just going and have a look at Power BI tips on YouTube or something like that. But ultimately, it's the same principle. It's all about deconstructing visuals into elements. So they have the same philosophy. Instead of starting with a chart, start with the components that build it up. So a bar chart is basically a rectangle. A line chart is, well, it's a line. Pie chart is a circle with angles. And possibly shouldn't be used all the time. But if you look at a chart, you can start to break it down functionally. And honestly, this is how the visuals in Power BI are constructed by developers. And myself as a developer, this is an approach I might use. Even if I'm writing code in a lower level language, this is how I need to think about constructing visuals so they make sense. And we might call this a grammar of graphics or marker-based visualization. That's a terminology we might throw around. And it's a large subject to delve into, and I don't have a lot of time today because I want to focus a little bit on the journey, but also on what we're going to show you. But the concept of the grammar of graphics pipeline, certainly in this case, was coined in a book by Leland Wilkinson. And the idea being that a visual or a chart can be built on a different set of steps. And each step is basically independent from the last. But we can see here that we start with our data and we work through almost a pipeline of determining any variables we need, the algebra, scales, statistics, geometry, coordinates, and aesthetics. So the visual stuff goes right at the end. And then ultimately it gets rendered at the bottom. Now this is probably the quickest way I can talk about this slide. I have another example that I can show you, but this is a very big subject. The book is huge. I don't know if anyone's read it, but it's great. But it is big, and it is not bedtime reading. But it is quite fascinating. So if we were to think about breaking a bar chart down using that process, this is a fairly high-level view. But if we were to start with a data set, so this is just a screen grab of a Power BI table, but we've got a categorical variable there called country. So we can see we've got 5 countries and we've got sales. So there's a measure there. So that's a quantitative amount. So how we might want to start thinking about representing that as a bar chart. If we think about a Power BI visual or any place we want to represent a visual, we have X number of pixels wide, Y number of pixels high on the screen, 2 dimensions either way. So we have our width and our height in terms of constraints. What we then need to think about is how we might encode or scale those values from the table using position. So with a bar chart, we might want to, if we're representing country which is nominal, it's often better to put it horizontally. And we would want to evenly space that down the height of the chart. So we would need the height of the chart and to work out the space of that all the way down. And then with the measure, we want that to run along the bottom of the chart, and the width of that chart will represent the value of that measure. So however much our physical size of the visual is, a proportion of that will relate to the amount of sales. If we start at a 0 axis, which we really should with a bar chart, how much of that is the sales amount? We then want to turn that into axes so that we can communicate those scales, because that doesn't mean anything unless we can actually read what they mean. So in this case, what we mean is putting the actual values in a way that we can read. So once we've worked out that spacing, we want to put the country evenly. And we want to put the amount along the bottom so that we can visually resolve that, which works very well for our brains. The last thing we want to think about is a mark, in this case, to represent the actual data. We've got the series and the measures. And in this case, what we would do is we would choose a rectangle and we would use 1 bar per country. And the width of that bar would be equal to the sales amount. What we can see very quickly is, this is a very fundamental chart, but it's a very fundamental way of thinking. We as humans can very easily resolve the length of those bars and infer which is the highest selling country, which is the lowest selling country. We may even sort it into order because it makes the most sense to know that's a logical question. So even though we've got it ordered by country, we may order it by sales, but we can very quickly make that out. But this is a little bit about what goes into the design of a chart from a developer's perspective. These are just things we drag onto the canvas and don't really think about sometimes. But if we want to implement that as a framework, what that would do is it would take such a specification, a set of steps, and it would produce a visual. So we saw with the R visual very quickly that we just put in a bunch of commands and we got an output that was basically what we described. But what happens then is if we want to revise the specification, we can think about, with that R visual, we could iterate our design. If we didn't like the spacing of the bars, we could go and change the percentage. We could add more clauses to do more things, to add more aesthetics, to possibly transform the data or change its orientation. We could even consider adding additional marks, like a line for an average. So we have the bar. Each bar represents sales, but we might want to overlay the average of all series as a line. And we can relate that relative to the bars, and we get an extra little bit of insight from the visual. The challenge with this is those tools are hard to implement well. They take a lot of research and development effort. So ggplot is the product of a lot of work, and it is a programming interface. But it is a simplistic programming interface, but it has taken a long time to implement the grammar of graphics into something that could be straightforward to use. And user interfaces that do it are incredibly rare. One that springs to mind is Tableau, if some of you have used Tableau. And Charticulator from Microsoft is a similar notion. It's a grammar of graphics UI. The Charticulator team have at least 8 people from Microsoft Research working on it. Tableau have a huge R&D team. So these are, if we want to build a UI that's flexible and powerful, that's a lot of effort. So you've got a lone developer like me who isn't Microsoft or Tableau, but still wants to help. So in my head, I'd like to put something somewhere in the middle. So a little bit between the R and Python, perhaps on the wrong side of code for most, but still give some flexibility. So one thing that I've learned through delivering the HTML content visual is that there are people that are quite keen to put the yards in because they care a lot about visualization, and they're happy to create DAX measures full of HTML that produce very rich output. So I wanted to try and improve upon that a little bit as well. So I was looking for something that would work, and I landed on Vega, which I got introduced to a few years ago. So I didn't really land on it so much as find a really good use for it, but it's a really, really good tool. It's from the University of Washington IDL, which are a very well-known location for producing these kind of things. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with D3. D3 is a product of these folks. So Mike Bostock and his colleagues who developed D3, they're out of Washington IDL. Some of the people that worked on Vega are now alumni who continue to maintain it, came out of there as well. Vega essentially is an abstraction of D3, and it uses JSON rather than JavaScript. So what we're looking at here is, instead of getting into the web development side of things, we're moving into a language like JSON, which as data professionals is possibly more intuitive to us. So for those of you, does anybody not know what JSON is? I think that's looking good. So JSON is a data structure of keys and values and arrays or lists. So it's fairly intuitive for a data professional to understand. And the Vega interpreter takes that JSON specification, something much like we did just now, and produces a visual. So what we'll do is we'll have a look at that example, but we use Vega. So over here, I have a tool. Actually, this is the Vega website. So they have a few examples here of what they could do. They have a lot of documentation. I could spend ages on this site, and I often do. It's part of my work, but just to give you an idea, I will provide this link for the slide deck. They also produce an editor. And what I've done here for time is I've wired this up, but what I want to do is just very quickly walk through what we've done. So here we have our data set, and what we've got here is our country and our sales. Let me just use the right zoom in mode, sorry. Realize I can use my mouse here. So this is what's known as an array, and this is a list of keys and values. So here we've declared a key called country, and it's got a value of Canada, and its sales is this amount. And we've repeated that for France, Germany, Mexico, and USA. So we've declared our data for our visual. We've declared the height and width of the container. We've declared scales to encode the data. So we've got the Y scale, which is our country. And we've said use the height of the visual and put a 10% padding between it. So we can start to see on the right, there is a little bit of padding between these bars. We have an X scale, which is bound to the sales field, and this spans the width. Then we have axes. We're going to use the Y scale, and we're going to orient it on the left. So I'm just going to jump out of this and just show you a little bit of declarative nature here. So if I were to change the orientation here, I could change that to say right, and the axis would appear on the right. So what I haven't had to do is work that out myself. I've just told the interpreter, put it on the right, and it's gone, oh, okay, I need to make this much space, and stuff works. Now, it's not intuitive, but it's just to give you an idea as to how straightforward it is. Similar thing with the X scale. If I don't like it on the bottom, I can put it on the top. Vega works out all the sciencey bits and just does it. But we've said, a similar thing. I could change the height here to 600, and it will do the physical calculations and translations for me, which is quite nice. The last thing we've got here are marks. Just zoom in on that for a second. So we've said this is a rectangle, and it is bound to our data set. And then on our encoding channel down here, its x coordinate starts at 0 on that scale, and its x2, which is its extent, is mapped to sales. So it spans from 0 to whatever Vega works out the physical distance of the sales measure value represents in pixels. We don't have to work that out, Vega does. And similar thing with the Y. Just haven't quite got the scrolling working, I apologize. The scale uses the Y scale, it places it based on the country value, and its height is a single, what we call band. So with these nominal categorical scales, each step of this is known as a band. So it's called a band scale. It's got a particular width. So we're using the whole height of the band. Now, that seems perhaps a little too much work. I get that. So fortunately, the Vega team have you covered, and they have a tool called Vega-Lite, which is, like it says, it's like a lower fat Vega, basically. It's built for common use cases. So tools like Power BI, where we're building common charts, they have design patterns for these things. They have marks that abstract a lot of what we just saw. Still uses JSON, sits on top of Vega. So we've got Vega-Lite, Vega D3. So it's abstracting a bit higher up. And it's much easier to start with for newcomers. And to be honest, I tend to use this more than Vega. And I've actually been able to achieve some quite incredible things with it. But let's revisit that. I'm just going to pull my editor back. And Vega and Lite also has their own website, which is all available from here. Again, we'll be slide the slide deck, but each tool has examples, tutorials, documentation, and so on. But if we look at the Vega editor, we should be able to see this on a single screen. So instead of manually prescribing everything we did before, we've declared our data set. I didn't talk about the schema before. The schema is what's known as, so JSON is essentially free structured. It has simple rules, but as long as it passes, it will work. So what a schema does is it provides structure to a JSON file. So Vega published schemas for both Vega and Vega-Lite, and what that does is that just enforces some validation, much like how a coding tool would do. So it just means that if I were to type something that it didn't support, it wouldn't be very happy. We have our data again. We have our height and our width. The only difference now is we have a marker bar, which is a shortcut to say create a rectangle. And all we have underneath are encoding channels for Y and X. Scale. So we just need to tell it how it should scale it, and that it will work it out for us. We don't have to say expand the width and the height and create the axis and everything else. And then with the X, we do the same thing. Field sales type quantitative. So scales have a few types. There is quantitative, there is temporal, the dates, and a couple of other types. But this just helps Vega-Lite to understand how to encode them. But we get a much similar output. I've been messing with the other one a little bit, but basically you get the same thing in a much more lightweight format. Quite prescriptive. Quite nice to get started with. So the next thing is kind of working in Power BI. So I got quite excited about this and I thought the same thing. And I had a look around because I thought somebody must have surely done this. But they kind of had, but hadn't completely. So what I found was there was a project called Power BI Vega-Lite, and it led me to a repository that Microsoft had produced, which was an example of how to integrate Vega-Lite with a particular specification. So a bar chart like we saw, we could plug that into some code, but we still had to bootstrap the whole visual. We had to learn how to write the visual, create the visual, learn how to integrate Vega, put the specification in, bind it to the fields that we would add, and there's still a bit of work to do there. So it wasn't what we really wanted for people that didn't really want to get involved with web dev. So I think the challenge we have here is that if you want to learn custom visuals, you basically got to get into web development, or you need to know someone that does. And web developers who may not know Power BI, you have to possibly do some work to explain to them how Power BI works. So what I was really looking to do here was, is there a way I can put a spec into a Power BI visual and then just use that as a way of prototyping and iterating? So as a result, there wasn't, so I got busy for a long time. And after a lot of false starts, I'm here to talk about DNF, which is what I'm branding declarative. I should drink some water, sorry. What happens when you talk and don't drink? Declarative visualization for Power BI. So the reason it's called DNF is the Vega ecosystem is based quite a lot around the star Vega and the constellation of Lyra. So Vega and Vega-Lite, there is an ecosystem there where they have a tool called Lyra, which is a lot more visual. In the constellation of Aquila, you have Altair, which is their main star, and then I don't know if any of you have seen something called Altair in Python, but Altair is a Python wrapper for Vega. So they already have that project. But what was left was DNF, which is part of the asterism known as the summer triangle, which connects those three stars together. So I nabbed it. And fortunately, the folks in the community were very welcoming about it. It was really just a working title, but I used it on a couple of social posts, so it seems to have stuck. Let's do a demo because we've spent a lot of time talking about some stuff and we really want to show you some things. So DNF is in what I would call public preview at the moment. Actually, let's take one step back. There's a website, again, which I'll provide a link. At the moment, this visual is not an app source. So it is much faster for me to iterate outside of app source. I don't think no one has submitted a custom visual here. It takes a while. Updates take even longer. So what I don't want to do is, while I'm prototyping and working with the community to try and work on this visual, I don't want to put it in app source and then wait a month for an update to come through. I want to get things out quickly and get feedback and iterate quickly. So right now there's a website. Hopefully that proves that I'm legit. Hopefully. But you can actually get the visual from here for now. You can download it, and every month or so I provide a new version. We're up to 0.4. We're working towards 1.0. 1.0, when we're ready, we'll put it into app source and we'll start the official process, so it's much more easy to get to. So for now, I've tried to give it some legitimacy by, well, hopefully a few people know who I am in the visualization community, and we've got a website. So if you've got a website, you've got to be legitimate, right? I think. Anyway, so for now, you would download. Have people installed visuals manually into Power BI? Yeah. So Power BI visuals, you can get them from app source, or you can install them from a file. The file is called a .pbiviz, and you would simply browse for it and install it. I'm not going to do that right now. But you download the file, and for any workbook you want to use it in, or if you're an org tenant and you feel keen to do it, you can load it as an organizational visual so that your users could choose it from the organizational store. But that will add the visual to your workbook. We'll just add this in. And we get this little fella here. So what we've got is a little landing page with some lovely version information and some resources that you can get to. So the website we just saw and the official documentation for the two tools. So Deneb is a self-contained Power BI visual. It includes the Vega and Vega-Lite runtimes. So it's not like R and Python, where you need to have R on your machine or R in a service. This thing will just work. Wherever you deploy it, doesn't matter whether if you give it to another user and they don't have the right runtimes, it's all inside the visual. So you deploy to the service, it looks exactly the same as it does in here. We need data for it to work. For the minute, I'm just going to add a mean temperature just so that we get something working. And what I'll do is the way that I do a lot of things when I start to develop visuals. Actually, first things first, on the first execution, we've got the ability to try and create from a template, and there's some pre-canned templates that I've added into the visual to try and help people get started. We've recently just added template importing into 0.3. So the idea is if somebody produces a visual, they're able to export it into a JSON file and share it, and someone else can import it in. But now we're just going to dismiss that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to that Vega editor and get that Vega-Lite visual. And I'm just going to paste that in. And I'm just going to run this up here. So this is going to render the visual in our little preview area here. Now, this is actually a development build. The reason I'm using it is because it's got features that make it easy to demo for people. This will come in about a few weeks' time, but the principle is the same. It's just this zooming capability that I just wanted to bring in case the screens weren't big enough. So, but we've got the same thing. We've got our data, we've got our height and our width, our mark, our encoding, and our spec. So with it being Power BI, we don't need that. We don't need that. And we don't need that. So much like an R visual, once we've got our data bound, what happened there? Oh yeah, I know what it is. It's because I haven't done this. And I haven't typed on this keyboard in a long time. Oh yeah, here we go. Why don't we look at the screen instead of looking at the screen in the other way? So what I'm going to do is just set this up here. So when we create a visual from scratch, it will boilerplate this for us. And what I'll do is I will actually demo that. The binding data set links back to whatever we have in here. So I've currently got mean temperature. If I pull city in, and what I'll do is I'll just run the repair on this and it will just format the JSON nicely so we can see it. But there's nothing here because country and sales don't exist, but city and mean temperature do. So we'll just fix that up. And we can run that now and we'll start to see some stuff happening, but we won't see any values. So we'll just start to type. Mean temperature will come up as a measure because that's in our data set. And now we've got a visual. So it's a bar chart. It's very exciting because we've got bar charts already. But if we jump back to our report, we can see that this fits inside the visual. And all that stuff we had to do about height and width is taken care of by denim. It's responsive, it just works. So one thing we can't do with a bar chart is to do something like add an average line to it. We can add a constant line with a constant value. You know, if we add just go back and demonstrate that, because some people may not have seen that. If I add my city and my mean temperature to a bar chart, if I go to my analytics pane, it can. That's perfect. In that case, we've got a demo there. Let's do something else. I've been looking at the wrong visuals. Let's do something a little bit different then. Instead of mean temperature and city, let's think about something that isn't really done. So we've got a sample, which is actually used to denote each temperature sample in our data set. So I'm going to take the city out, and I'm going to put the sample in. Now this changes a little bit because our data doesn't exist, but we can see we've got a whole bunch of rectangles here. So let's edit this. And this has got a lot of data points in it, so let's just do something a bit simpler. So instead of a bar, let's just do a box plot. And now we can basically just do a box plot with a little piece of code and a single measure. So this is just something that you can't do without a custom visual in Power BI, but it doesn't. It's, oh dear, let me just drink some water, sorry. Similar thing here though, we can drag in our city and we can repeat that encoding. Long day. Why is that going wrong? Because I didn't add city to the visual. Dear me, you do stuff live, huh? There we go. So we can immediately start to add this and start to explore it. What I will do is, because I obviously haven't thought about that particular visual issue, maybe I was using this one before, the stacked bar chart, which is an issue. So forgive me, I am going to go back to my script. But what I'll do is I will add in my pre-prepared text. So what we can do with Vega-Lite is we can do what's called adding layers. So if I use the same data, it's quite easy for me to, we'll paste this in, but we'll start to unpack it a little bit. So often what you might do is, oh dear, having one of those days, huh? Let's get that fixed. And let's replace that. No, that's good. So we'll replace that there. Apply that. So what we've done here, let me just zoom that in a bit, is we've introduced a concept called layering. I'll just make the fonts a bit bigger in the editor as well. So nice things we can do. Let's make that a smidge bigger. We've introduced layers, and I'll just collapse these down. So our first layer, I've given it a description because it's nice to document things. I've got my city on the Y. I've put a little padding of 30% between it, and I've encoded my X just like normal. So that's all well and good. And then within here, I've got my bar. And then what I've also got is a text mark, which is a label. Now that's not particularly exciting because that's not formatted. The reason that is like that is because if we were to get the formatted value from the data model, it would be a text value and we won't be able to work with the raw number, but we have functionality for that. At the minute, we're just working in stages. So for this layer, we have mapped the encoding of this and this together to the same value, and we've laid it on top. And what we've also done is we've added an average line, which uses an aggregate. So we could use different types of aggregates. And we've got our mean temperature in here, and this sits over the top. So we're starting to build this up, which is probably not too impressive, being as we just saw that bar chart visual did the same thing, which is great, huh? But what we'll do is we'll just illustrate what we can do with a template. So with a little bit of work, let's just grab that visual. So as part of the templating capability, I can add a description, and I can take my fields and rename them so they're more generic, and I can choose the fields I've got in my data set here. So let's just add city to the category and value to the mean temperature. We'll hit create, and this will go through and take that template and produce something a little more Power BI-like. So this is a slightly longer item of JSON, but what it means is as I've gone through, I've been able to build this up iteratively and start to customize things how I like. So the scale and padding for city are basically the same. We've still got our bar, we've still got our text with our alignment and our offset here. So if we don't like where the label is, we can start to change these things quite easily. So we could change that to 25, and it would push the labels further out. We could move it inside if we wanted to. We could change it to -25, and that would put it inside the end of the label if we were so inclined. So where this becomes powerful is where we can start to customize every little aspect of things that may not be exposed. With our aggregate line and label, we can actually apply complex expressions in Power BI formatting to add degrees C instead of standard Power BI like dollars or something like that. We can actually create format strings within the visual that may not be part of the data model. I mean, we can do custom format strings, so that is something possible, but we could change the decimal places. We could define different specifications. We can offload that slightly so it sits above the line. But the specification is used to deal with things like encoding and dynamic properties. What we also have at the top here is the config tab, and that allows us to specify theming. So for anything that we like, we can assign properties and all kinds of things. So if you're familiar with web development, there are attributes of any kind of element that may not be exposed through conventional Power BI visuals, but we can start to play around with things. So for instance, if we didn't like the padding between the axis labels, we could change that. We could make it say 50. And the bars will get pushed out, the calculations will all be done. So this is a very simple chart, but it starts to help us to understand how we can start to play around with things that may not be exposed. If we wanted to turn the axis off, we can, which we've done here. We've turned the ticks off. We've turned the domain line off. If we like that, we could put it back on. And that's just going to create a line along each axis. We could customize that for the x-axis versus the y-axis. So if I didn't want wanted my domain back to be false, enable it for my y-axis, I could just do it here. And what I've got then is a nice little origin line along here, but not along here. And I can start to customize every little facet of what I'm doing.
Can you explain just what domain is, just like some kind of default that it was getting from that web?
Yeah. If we take all the configuration out, we've got something much like we saw here. So Vega have a whole bunch of defaults. Yep. So there's this little, this is line here, there's a line here, there's all these ticks, there's all these grids and things, which might be what you want. But what I kind of like with visuals is I like to try and design them for information density. I like to try and remove redundant elements, and I like the user to be able to infer things quickly. So what I've done is I've removed the x-axis because I can put labels on the end. I can already infer the distance using my using my eyes. I don't have to work that out. Now,
sorry, one more question.
Yes.
And I take it that just because things aren't in that config file doesn't mean you can't add them. I'll give you an example. What if I wanted to justify those titles, Auckland, Christchurch, Dunedin, Tauranga, or Wellington?
Yeah, you can add it. So the documentation, if we were to look at the documentation for Vega-Lite.
Right, so that's the question, how do you know what attributes there are?
Well, this is where the documentation comes in handy. So the nice thing about this tool is it's not proprietary to Microsoft. It's proprietary. It's across the industry. There's a number of people who use it, and the tool is regularly updated. So as part of the alumni that from the University of Washington Data Lab that are working on this are still developing. It's actively developed. We're up to version 5 of Vega-Lite now, and they're working on 5.2 right now. So the concepts themselves are all documented down here. We can do transforms. So we can do aggregates of measures. We can do complicated density transformations. So things like the violin plot, the box plot, things that are hard to do in DAX can be done in the visual. So you can actually, whilst we try not to keep logic downstream, we may need to apply it in the visual. And this gives us the ability to start to do things and layer things over the top. So we have our aggregates, we have our marks, so we have different types of marks. So if we wanted to look at the kind of properties they had and how configuration works, we can just go to the mark documentation, and there are examples, and it tells you all the properties and what the values are, and it helps you to understand exactly how these things fit together. And then some marks have specific documentation, and you can look at each type of mark. So there's the box plot mark, there's the circle mark, there's the point mark, the rectangle and the bar are slightly different. They're the same shape, but the bar is more of a convenience function. So a rectangle, you can lay out all the coordinates, or with a bar, you can say it's this long.
Mhm.
So it's a convenience function, but there's documentation for how to do the data encoding. So those X and Y that we saw, but you can also encode data to transparency or color or all kinds of things. So many properties that you see, you can set static values for them, like we just saw with the label padding, but there's a lot of them you can bind them to data. So you can actually bind the size of a font, or all these kind of things that aren't necessarily bound to data in the properties pane, and you can start thinking about all kinds of weird and wonderful ways of expressing data through those encoding channels, which is quite handy. We also have what's called view composition. So what we're seeing right now is a single view with layers on top. So we've got a bar chart with a line, but what Vega-Lite does is exposes what's called facets. Now you might know facets as small multiples. Anybody not familiar with the concept of small multiples? No, good, okay. What's nice about the facet channels is they have row and column. So rather than just having a chart repeated, you could have a small multiple by one field and then small multiple by another. So you can have a matrix of scatter plots or line charts with different variables. So when you start to think about how these are composed, you get some really interesting ideas. They have what they call concatenation. So even though your visual uses a single data set, you can stick different charts together in the same visual that use the same query. So you might transform them differently, but you can put together a heat map with bar charts on the margin, so that you're actually able to look at distribution in conjunction with lower level of detail. So it gets quite powerful. And this is a single DAX query. This is the nice thing. So previously in Power BI, where you may put visuals on top of each other to achieve a result, or next to each other, and each visual has its own query, you may see some user experience issues. This works around that. What I will do very quickly is I'll just finish up the key difference between this and the R visuals, and then I'll show you a couple of the composition features. One of the things we're working on is, because Vega-Lite is designed for the web and Power BI is built for the web, we're able to leverage some of the interactivity features of Power BI, whereas the R and Python visuals are sent off to an external R or Python interpreter, and they return an image that you can't interact with. Vega returns something that's in the same domain object model, that's a web page, as the Power BI app. It's in a custom visual, so it is sandboxed, but what it means is that we can actually hook into it. So what we've started to do is we've introduced the tooltip handler. So if we have a tooltip page in our report that's mapped to something we've got in, I can hover over that bar and I get a report page tooltip. And that's not something that I can do with an R or Python visual. So as long as my row context is preserved, I can map that up. If I've got a report page tooltip, we can send that back to Power BI to say, this is our row, and do you have a report page tooltip? And Power BI deals with the report page tooltip for us. It's not something that we as developers do. Excuse me. Gotta breathe. You get excited about something, you gotta breathe in the middle. Gotta breathe. But similarly, we can just turn that off. So we can force it to use a default tooltip. And its default is, if it can't resolve, it will do a similar thing to other visuals. So you can just have it show a standard tooltip. One of the nice features is that you can't do with a core visual. With core visuals, any field you put in, it typically gives it to you in a tooltip. So if you added a whole bunch of fields to this and you only wanted to see city and mean temperature, but you wanted to use other fields to do things, you could specify the contents of the tooltip. You could add more stuff. You could add static text. You could add something else. So you actually have the ability, using the Vega tooltip logic, this just wraps that logic and sends it to Power BI. So we're starting to integrate it. What we're looking to do is to wire up cross-filtering and context menus and drill through. They'll be the next things we're looking at. So they're a couple of months away, but we're starting to make some inroads into those. Now, with some visuals, if the data set is transformed away from the row context that we send in, that actually represents different data to what Power BI knows about. So with visuals, we can't communicate out to the data model. We just know about the data Power BI gives us. So with report page tooltips, with drill through, with selection, it's all about telling Power BI, you gave us that data, it's this row that you gave us, I want to display a tooltip, or I want to highlight another visual based on that. As soon as we start transforming things away, this preserves the row context. But if we were to do, say, a box plot or a distribution plot where it's a very complex set of aggregates, we lose that. But in those cases, we try and fall back to these kind of behaviors. So at least you get some insight. So we can't solve everything. But what we want to try and do is to give you a lot of capabilities without having to learn how to write code in the web domain. You'll have to learn how to get busy with JSON, but it does give you a lot of flexibility with your visual design. So how are we doing for time, Jeff? We're getting there, aren't we?
I've got all night, Daniel. Just keep on talking.
So we're able to change from Vega-Lite to Vega if we want. The visual supports both. I would recommend, if you were interested, start with Vega-Lite. And as I said, I don't really stray out of Vega-Lite because it gives me most of what I want. Now, another thing we looked at was a box plot, but another variation of that is a distribution plot. So this is what we call like a smooth histogram. You know, it's a kernel plot. If you've seen the violin plot, it's the same principle. We take samples and values and we plot the distribution of those values. So we can see here that most of it's in the 12-degree range. And this is for 5 cities in New Zealand. What's really nice about this is the same composition we've seen. This is a single view. Now, what we can do very easily is add an extra category to that and ask it to produce facet plots based on that. So if we were to open this up, all we've done is we've said, this is the transform we've done, which creates the density plot and works it out. Make sure we group it by city, and then in the encoding, where we've had our X and Y, just add a row encoding. And then this produces the same visual 5 times. And if there were, you know, if we change the filter, you know, if we added in Hamilton, then it'll just work it out. So I'm just using this for convenience, just because but what's nice about this is, since we have the row encoding, that single view of temperature across New Zealand looks very different by city. So obviously Dunedin has a much lower but broader span, whereas Auckland tends to be clustered around here. Interestingly, Tauranga and Wellington are fairly similar, considering where they are on the North Island to each other. But what we can do if we're so inclined, and I urge you to think about this. If you think about all the times you put a visual into a canvas, a core visual, and played around in the properties pane and tried to play with DAX and calculation groups and try and bend it to your will and do whatever you like, if you invest a few hours into a design, you can produce something like this, which is basically the same visual we just saw, but with a lot more functionality around it. So it's the same data set, but what we've been able to do is use the row to lay this out. But we've got the same distribution plot, but what I've done is I've styled it up using fill colors, and I've actually put another line behind it to produce this halo effect. So it actually breaks through the other levels. I've added the 5%, the 95%, the quartiles, the median. So this is almost like a box plot around the distribution plot. So you can see where most of the, where the interquartile range is. And this is exactly the same 3 values you see in this table. What we're able to do is to start doing calculations and overlays. And the other thing I did was I actually added a mouse tracking line, because that's another thing we can do is Vega actually has some interactivity tooling where we have to do this ourselves, but if we wanted to add interactivity, and we can do this, we can track mouse events. We can start to add this is a ruler that just follows the mouse and shows it and hides it based on where it is. So we can immediately start to give our users a lot more insight. But this is a visual you couldn't really produce unless you actually went back to the bare metal and started to build it up from scratch. And if I want to change parts of it, I could just, instead of going back to my Visual Studio Code and change some code, recompiling it and testing it and seeing if the property works, I can just go into this config and I can start to play around. So if I didn't like that grid color, I could change that in here. And that's something you can do in a properties pane, but when you start to look at the kind of things that's required to actually go back and develop a custom visual from scratch, it's quite tricky. So I would say, I've had a bit of practice, but this probably took me about 4 or 5 hours to get right. To give you an idea, the violin plot visual that I built, that was about a 5-hour prototyping exercise with static data. And then it took another 195 hours to make it work generically. So that's making it responsive to all the different sizes that people might use. A lot of the work that goes into visuals is all the different use cases that other people might use it for that you don't know about. It's really easy to build a visual that does one thing, but to make it respond, to make it work with different types of data, is quite tricky. So this is all about, this is not a glamorous user interface. It's not clicky, draggy, droppy. But for people that wish to get more prescriptive with visuals, this is a way in without having to go all the way down to the bottom.
So Daniel,
So
having mastered this piece and got it right and to your satisfaction, can you, not you as you the developer, but you as the builder of the visual, now export that as a template for somebody else?
Yep. So just in version 0.3, we've added this feature to generate a template. And what this will do is it gives a little dialogue that, so what I should stress is this doesn't create a custom visual. It creates a template that somebody can import into another DNF visual.
Yeah, I understand.
Much like how the Charticulator visual works in AppSource. So we can type in a name for our template. We can type in a description, and I can put my name because I'm proud of that. And then when we get into the data set, it looks at everything we've got here. And the reason it does that is you may not use them, but sometimes you might introduce a column in here for granularity purposes. So you may not use it in your spec, but you may use it to get the data set how you want it. So we put this in here, but we can see we've got a text box here that says it was the sample column, the city column, and the mean temperature. Now I might want to change that to granularity, and I might want to change that to category, and I may want to change that to measure. Whoops. And I can type in a little description here to help somebody, but ultimately I can alias these. So if I've got something that's perhaps sensitive, if I've got fields from my model that may expose things about my data that I may not want to make available to other people, I have the ability to type over that here. And then what happens is, and this is a limitation of custom visuals, unfortunately, and we have the same issue with Charticulator, is we're not able to directly save a file out of a visual for security reasons. So what happens is we generate the template, and then you're able to copy that and save it in a JSON file. So what that might look like is if I were to go to a new tab, and I'll just add that sample. It's a simple model, so I don't have anything new I can demo it on. But if I change that to a DNF visual, and I just open it up, and we can do the import from template, and I'll choose my template. And this is here's one I prepared earlier, but just to give you an idea, I went and filled everything out. So I've got, it's called facet distribution plot. It's a complete example with formatting and interactivity. And my field is called granularity. And I typed the description in, so it gives me a tooltip that I can hover over to get more information. And I can choose my column. And so what we've decided to do with this is it's basically columns or measures. So even though this is a number, you could choose a textual column. So what we don't want to do is force you to use the same data type. We just want to suggest it. So it just means that you've got to, because the idea is not everyone's data is the same. So once you get the template in, you may have to do a bit of work to fix it up, but it's all about trying to save time. So if we choose city as our row and our measure is mean temperature, then we get the option to create, and that will put the plot in, and I can see that my visual viewport is just a little bit too small. Now, one thing that we can't do, unfortunately, is programmatically change this. So what this means is that we need to change some aspect of the visual to make it fit inside the visual, or we'll need to resize it when we leave. So it's just gonna, but it will scroll, which is one thing that tools like Charticulator don't do. So if I were to say maybe change this to, let's say 100, and hopefully 125 will do it. Nah, it's too much. 15 maybe. We can play cat and mouse all day. I just want to do it cleanly, but if I can't, then I won't. Either way, we can see that it pushes off the bottom. If I go back to the visual now, I'll get my scroll bars. It's a little bit too short as well, but I can scroll it. So if I've got a visual that's quite complex, I can actually build the capability for it to scroll, but normally what I probably do is want to just drag it out. But it does mean that if you've got more than you thought of, it will accommodate that. So one of the challenges with the tool like Articulator, it's all designed to sit on a single pane of glass, and it means that you get some difficulties if you run over. So
just on this, so if we had a bigger canvas, it would be responsive if it's able to be. Like for instance, if you, I'm a bit confused by when the scroll bars get put in. So if we made these rectangles thinner, could we, if we made it below, if we drag the canvas below a certain dimension, would it put the scroll bars up? But then if we drag the canvas out, would the rectangles grow to full screen?
you're going to like this answer. It depends.
That's
So-
trademarked.
Yeah. So with the composition, we have single, we have layered, we have facets and concatenations. The facets and concatenations are quite complicated. We have to manually prescribe their size. With single or layered plots, we can tell Vega and Lite to work it out.
Okay.
So if we don't supply height and width, thank you, we can make it respond. Or we can actually fix it. So with the case of a bar chart, we may not want it to stretch because we may slice and dice and it may be 10 fields or 5 fields. We don't want the bars to be inconsistent. So we can do what's called then give it a step width. So each band is, let's say, 30 pixels, and it will grow and shrink based on slicing and dicing. So that we can make it fit. We can make it fit to a certain width and have the height grow and shrink. So you have control over not so much it. So version 0.4 we put out yesterday, that still has some issues where it does respond to the size of the container, but 0.5, which you're seeing here, which should be out in a month or so, has a lot more control over height and width, and you can actually override a lot of things. So you have a lot of control over how the visual looks and behaves. So you can tell it to stretch, or you can say, I want it to be exactly 600 pixels, and it will constrain it to that. But you have flexibility. What we want to try and do is give you flexibility. And because the tool is so scope, massively in scope, it's very flexible, very extensible. I can't catch everything. So I'm learning as I go, because the more excited I get about features I deliver, the more excited, because I use this in my work. It's, I originally started building it for me as a faster way of building visuals. To give you an idea, this plus a tool like Articulator, both of these tools are roughly, I can develop a visual in 10% of the time it takes me to develop a full custom visual. So in terms of professional work that I do for people, I can charge people 10% of the price I would normally charge for a visual. And a lot of the challenges people don't get about custom visuals is that there's a lot of boilerplate code around them that takes a long time to establish, and each one's different. Each one has its own behavior, and every customer has their own different requirements. What we like about this is that it's easy to tweak. You don't have to go back to a developer if you want to change a font size or you want to change a little bit of spacing. You can experiment and explore and change mark types on the fly. So if we didn't like this, if we didn't like the line, we can get to a point where, if your client says, or your user says, I don't really like the line, can I make it an area? Then, Vega-Lite has the ability to change that mark on the fly. You can just say, well, here's my density line. Let's just change it to an area, and hit the button, and there you go. I don't like that. Change it back.
Is there an undo control?
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent.
Yep. So,
is there commenting as well? You can comment things out and see what they do?
You can't comment because JSON unfortunately doesn't really support comments.
Okay.
So the way the language works is you can have descriptions that don't do anything, but you can use them to help document your work, which I use a lot because I'm a furious documenter. So they have thought about a lot of stuff. So we're learning as we go. We're getting, we're starting to get more people use it. We're getting features coming in, which is good, because at the minute I'm really just managing this as a tool that I want people to have. In terms of what other people are doing, there is a very great visual developer, Kerry Kolosko, who is out in Australia. She's using it quite a lot for Make Cover Monday activities. This is a recent thing she did with budgeting results in the States. So just from these 5 values, she was able to produce a facet plot with X and Y coordinates and shading based on the outcome of the winner. And that actually turned into this finished product. So this was the Power BI report, but this is the visual this is a single visual, and this has report page tooltip functionality, and you can learn more about it as you go. So this is quite a nice example of something that you can't quite do very easily, but you can actually, I mean, what we saw there, Kerry's finished version is a little bit more complex, but to get the actual structure together, it's this much JSON. And that's cosmetic stuff as well, including the corner radius, where we can actually smooth the corners off. So it's little things like that. You know, often I get people ask me that they want a bar chart visual with rounded corners. That's not for me to decide whether that's right or not, but you can actually do that in here. You can just do a rounded. You know, I did one here as an example a little while back. Here's my block. Yeah, so I did a bar chart with rounded corners just to show that it was actually different and it wasn't a core bar chart. But and you can do that on the end, on all the bars, on one corner, on opposite corners. You've got a lot of control over it.
So Daniel, how much did you say this cost? If we want to go home and start doing this tomorrow ourselves?
This is nothing. This is free. This is open source. I'm doing this for fun. I don't know why, because I enjoy it, I think. But honestly, one of the key things I've learned is I had a little bit of web development knowledge before I started learning custom visuals, but it is often something that we perhaps don't have time for. We may be interested, but it's quite a high learning curve. It turns a lot of people off when they develop custom visuals, and you do gain appreciation as to why visuals are hard to deliver well. So you may have gripes with the core visuals, but they're actually quite tricky to do as well as Microsoft have done, honestly. But at the same time, you haven't got time to put that in on demand. It's really hard. With the HTML content visual, I learned that people were prepared to put a bit of time in, their own time, to produce their own visuals that had their own styling or whatever, and that was just within the formula bar or tabular editor if you're using that. So I've got just very passionate about, you know, I'm a developer. I'm a creative developer, but I'm not the most creative developer. People like Kerry, so a little bit more of her work actually. She has a blog, kerrykolosco.com, where she's starting to post her experiences with it. So she was able to produce this. And what's nice about Kerry is she kind of shows it working. So she was able to start, you know, she's prototyping ideas. She's live testing things. She's seeing what works and what doesn't work and adapting. So she kind of goes through the journey here, and, you know, she's trying all kinds of designs, and she's explaining her thought process and how she's thought about going through the visual. She did a marginal bar heat map. These are concatenated plots. This one was quite a nice post, how she looked at different designs for the same data within a single spec. So these are all basically the same spec, just with slightly different tweaks. So where a line is, this one here, she just replaced it with a bar. It's just one tweak. So if you this line can be easily replaced with a bar. Vega will just do it. Excuse me, Vega will just do it. You want to change a point, you want to put a point on there, it's fine. But these are all little tweaks she's able to make with the same spec. You're able to make them really tiny. Take out the bits you don't need, make them really tiny, make micro charts. You might like that.
Absolutely.
So, you know, the sad part is that whilst I use it a lot in my work, because one of the nice things is about eating your own dog food. You know, I'm not just saying, hey, here's a visual, go nuts. Here's a visual that I'm using too, and I'm learning about my frustrations, and I'm putting that actively into developing the visual. Kerry's really good at giving me feedback. I hope that other people might find it useful, and you know, the visual is on GitHub. So this is the documentation site that I build and I maintain with every release. What I've tried to do is focus on the Power BI specific parts of it, and you're able to jump into the Vega and Vega-Lite documentation for further learning. So there's a worked example. We talk about how the data set binding works. We talk about the visual editor. We talk about how to do the formatting, how to work with templates, things to think about with performance. So one thing this visual can do is break the row limit with custom visuals. We can load more than 30,000 rows. But there are performance things to think about when you do that, because there's more elements on the page, the performance may go down. How interactivity starts to work. So this will be beefed up with more sections as we start to deliver more features. A little bit of info about support. It's basically free, so you get what you pay for. But I want this to be a really good alternative for visualization in Power BI. Vega and Vega-Lite are incredibly powerful frameworks developed by some of the best people in the field. And if we can tap into that, that'd be awesome. There's a privacy policy. So again, I'm a website. You have to trust me. But I'm quite upfront about that. The visual doesn't send anything anywhere. We've actually internally firewalled it as well, so it can't load resources, and that's something that we would ideally like to have in place for certification. I'd like to try and certify it when it goes to app source. It's a special visual. There's not many like it, so we have to really look at the visualization certification rules. So I can't guarantee it's going to be certified when it goes in, but I'm going to try really hard to get it certified because that's another thing that a lot of people want out of the visuals is certified. If it's certified, it's been fully reviewed by Microsoft. It doesn't do anything nefarious. So I'm publishing the changelog. Contributors page is really just me at the minute, but the source code is fully available if anyone wants to look at it. At the minute, it's really just me, but everything's here. It's open source. It's free. I want it to be free and open source. So if people value it and want to sponsor me, that's great. If you don't, that's also fine. I'm very fortunate that I'm able to accommodate some of my free time to work on this. I would love to be able to accommodate all my time to work on it because I think there's a long way to go. But there is still a long way to go, and we're working on getting 1.0 together, hopefully by the end of the year. So that will be an app source, and hopefully we'll have all the things we want. We will see how it goes. But ultimately, for further reading, you've got the Vega sites. These will be, I'll make the slide deck available to you, Jeff, I think.
Thank you. Yeah.
There'll be links in there, but there are examples. Maybe we'll focus on Vega-Lite, actually. The documentation is there. Now, I can't promise 100% that everything works, but if stuff comes up, raise a bug, let me know about it. I'll look at it. I want this thing to be as rich and powerful as possible. But yeah, we can start with simple bar charts. We can copy paste these in. You can start to apply them to your data. So there's all kinds of scenarios, pyramid charts, diverging stack bar charts, putting your labels at the bottom if you don't want to have them on the side of the axis, histograms, density plots, histogram heat maps, all kinds of scatter plots, bowl plots, line charts. With one of the coolest things is, I don't know if it's on here actually, they have what's called a trail mark. There it is. So you can have a line chart that has variable width based on another measure. So you can have your normal measure, but you can also thicken the line based on another one. So here we've got stock price for a few indices that varies based on its distance. All kinds of things, area charts. Basically, you can start with these and work it out, but it's incredibly rich. Linear regression, so you can do regression calculations inside a scatter plot. Error bars and bands, confidence intervals. It's awesome.
You can do anything here that you would see in storytelling with data.
Like yes, you basically can.
Yeah, and that's the point of it, right? Is that it gives you absolute flexibility at little cost.
Yeah, I like that. I thought you would like that.
Well, my only question is, why the hell aren't I using it already? That's my only question, and I know you've been asking that as well.
I've wondered. But there's lots of community examples, and I hope my call to action really is, I'm developing this thing. I would love to promote it and talk about it all the time, but I really hope there are, people like Kerry really inspired me. I hope there are other people that take this, run with it, and are able to produce awesome things. The development, being a developer shouldn't be a barrier to entry to producing awesome visuals. We can close the gap, and I'm hoping this is going to be much more of a standard for visual development inside Power BI.
What do you think this means to Tableau users who have been looking at Power BI and going, well, I don't like it because it doesn't have that language or grammar or whatever?
They'll probably still look at it and go, it's not as great as creating charts in Tableau. But the concepts are the same. So honestly, I'm not a big Tableau user, but I am very envious of how Tableau's UI works. I have used it. I do appreciate how well it does things. I would love to see something similar. For the minute, as a solo developer with no R&D team or any paid people, we're going to have to just truck away with the specifications for now. But for now, I think this gives us the most flexibility. We'll see where it goes. But being able to use the grammar of graphics within Power BI, I think, is an awesome thing that could make a lot of difference to a lot of people.
I've got a colleague I think of would love this because we've just been working through trying to publish something. I work for a government entity, and they have multiple layers that they have to get through to publish something publicly, and it'll be the first time that our entity does that. And they've really been struggling with all the different layers of a criticism, and I could see how you could actually have overcome each of those layers with what you've provided here, even at the 0.4 or whatever.
Nice. So I mean, we've got a long way to go, but it's already quite. I mean, Discovery AI, the company I work for, as I said earlier, a lot of the visuals we need to work with aren't standard in Power BI. So we're able to show that Power BI can do stuff that perhaps we didn't think it could do before. Yes, it's a custom visual. Yes, it's not certified yet, but if you're using publish to web, if you're not so worried about the PDF exports and you trust me, you know, I think if I were caught doing anything nefarious, I wouldn't be an MVP for much longer. And I like being an MVP. It gives me opportunities to do things.
And it stops you from doing nefarious things.
It's
really good.
Helps to account.
Yeah.
Self-governing. But no, it's I'm just very passionate about improving things with Power BI. But yeah, no, I think honestly, if they want to give it a go, I really recommend it. See how they get on with it, and I'd love to hear any feedback, whether it's through the GitHub repository, whether it's LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever. I just like to know people are using it. Like I say, I built it for me. I've already seen some people use it. I'm happy they're happy. I want a lot more people to be happier.
I think it's a genuine. Do you want to take questions from people dialed in? Do you want to take questions now?
I think we're basically done.
Cool.
I've talked about. There's a couple of slides on the slide deck that I've talked about without showing. So I think we'll make the slide deck available if that's all right, and then I'm happy for any questions outside of that. But yeah, if you've got questions, go for it.
Before people leave, I would just love to give Daniel a round of applause for stellar effort. Before we bring questions on.
I'm really sorry about that bar chart example. I thought I had that locked, but never mind. We'll find a better one for next time. I'm still working this presentation out. It's quite a lot to get into an hour. You could spend probably half a day on just playing around in it and finding stuff that it can't do. Anyway, I'll find a better example next time.
You showed a good example of Charticulator versus Vega, and the bonus of Charticulator is that you didn't have to get your hands dirty into a little bit of JSON. But it seemed to me that JSON was a pretty low barrier to entry, and maybe even a lower barrier entry to working out how to drag drop stuff in Charticulator.
I think it has. It definitely has. It depends on how you think. I mean, they both use the same concept. Honestly, if you can start to think about how to break a visual down, it makes Charticulator a lot easier. And I have a lot of time for the tool. I actually contribute a little bit to Charticulator, not massively. I've been grateful that a couple of my features have gone in. But it's a great tool, and I do see, you know, I start with my core and I work through. So sometimes I use Charticulator, and this is a prototyping tool for more ambitious projects, but it's just easier than starting with a raw development project for getting started. But you know, with the JSON, you know, there's a repair and format tool that, you know, if your coding is, you know, you don't necessarily give due care and attention to spaces, it will indent it nicely. It will, you know, if you don't, you know, if I take the double quotes off this property here, the interpreter doesn't like it. It will tell you where the problem is, but a repair may forgive that and it will fix it up. So there is this is a tool, this is a library called JSON Editor. So this is a pre-canned library, this part of the UI. And the author of that is very good at what he does, and he's got a very good sanitization library as part of it. So we're able to hook into that and try and apply it to what we're doing. Sometimes you can't get around it because JSON just doesn't pass. But yeah, I'd like to try and improve the editor, but like everything, I've just got to find out amount of time, and I have a list as long as my arm of things I want to do. But we'll get there. We'll definitely get there.
Mimon, who's dialing in, says it's not a question, but tell Daniel I'm already using it in production.
Oh, nice.
And I know he's dialing in from Queensland.
Thank you, Mim.
So,
your compliment yesterday on Twitter was lovely, by the way. I think I should get that on a t-shirt.
You should see the compliment that Mim gave me just earlier today.
Yeah?
It was an accent affirming comment.
I see it as quite a rewarding amount of like output, like with the Python and R, I've always been like, is it worth it? You know, like for what you have to learn versus the output, you know, that you're saying it's a static image, and really is it that worth it? But for this, I can sort of see like, you know, time invested versus the output. I see something worth investing the time.
Yeah, and this is definitely a tool, you know, apart from some of the Power BI specific parts of it that we're going to have to try and wire up so that you get a better experience. They're portable. The specs are portable. You can copy that and paste that into the Vega editor, and you'll need the data, but it would work somewhere else. And that's the nice thing about it. Sorry, Mim, were you saying something?
No, just so basically we're trying to do charts last week, and like we had a fight in the office. There's no way to do it in Power BI, and there was some heated discussion. I cannot say it in public. And yeah, and yesterday, actually 2 days ago, I started using the Vega-Lite, the DNAP, and now I'm telling the guys which color he wants. So thank
That's
you.
awesome.
It was a big deal.
No, you're
Thank
welcome. Thank you. Yeah, people using it is just thanks enough. So I really appreciate it.
You should have made a financial bet on that, Mim. Like, you know, I bet you 1,000 Australian dollars. It can be done.
No, the problem, you know, like the problem is, like, I know Vega-Lite, I know it can do anything. Initially, I thought that the guy wanted to drill down, which is not possible, but it turned out that he don't want it. Actually, we made compromise. We just added like square on the top of Vega-Lite where they can just drill down, and yeah, it did work.
Yeah, we'll get there. We'll definitely get there. We'll figure it out. Don't worry.